Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'd like to welcome our listeners to this webinar on innovative no-till using multi-species cover crops to improve soil health. My name is Jeff Birkby, and I'm Outreach Director for a program called ATRA, the National Sustainable Agriculture Information Service. ATRA is funded by USDA and is managed by a nonprofit organization called NCAT, or the National Center for Appropriate Technology. We've been hosting a series of webinars on sustainable agriculture topics over the past couple of years and are pleased to bring you this special webinar on innovative no-till techniques. A couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started today. Today's webinar will last about 45 minutes, followed by perhaps 15 minutes or so of questions and answers. On your screen during the webinar, you'll see a block where you can type questions during the presentations. We'll filter through these questions during the webinar and ask our presenters to respond to a handful of those that have been asked. If you don't get your question answered during the webinar, there will be information presented on screen on how you can call our ATRA Technical Assistance Hotline and speak with a specialist after the webinar to talk more about no-till techniques. Today's webinar is sponsored by three organizations: the National Resource Conservation Service, NCAT ATRA, and the Burleigh County Soil Conservation District. Susan Tallman is a certified crop advisor with NCAT in Montana. And Susan, I'd like to welcome you to the webinar.
Thanks, Jeff. It's great to be here. Hi, everybody, and thanks for attending. Before we start, I wanted to clear up some confusion. One of the first press releases that advertised this webinar spoke of plowing under cover crops, but this is not the case. Because we're talking about no-till systems, termination of these cover crops is through harvesting, grazing, or some other non-soil disturbing techniques. So we apologize for any confusion and hope this clarifies what we're talking about today. With that, I'd like to introduce our main speaker, Jay Fuhrer. I first met Jay and some members of the Burleigh County Soil Conservation District in 2009 at the Montana Soil and Water Conservation meeting. They all gave remarkable presentations on the benefits of using multi-species cover crop cocktails and their resulting improvements in soil health. I was really impressed with their knowledge of soil biology and plant diversity and their willingness to try something new in order to improve the soil resource. Since that time, I've had the opportunity to travel to the Bismarck, North Dakota area and meet with Jay and several of those farmers and ranchers who are using these cocktails. And together we're developing some in-depth case studies and some web-based videos to really detail how they successfully use these cocktails. So if today's webinar piques your interest and you'd like more in-depth information, look for these materials on our ATRA website. They're not available as of today, but they should be available by probably first quarter of 2011. A little bit more about Jay. Jay's a conservationist employed by the Natural Resources Conservation Service in Bismarck, North Dakota. He grew up on a small grain and livestock farm, and his interests have always centered on agriculture. He emphasizes soil health as a foundation for cropping systems, grazing systems, and cover crops when working with Burleigh County producers. Information and education activities strive to utilize a team approach with farmers talking to farmers about soil health. Jay's interest in soil health has resulted in numerous speaking engagements within the U.S., Canada, France, and Russia. So thanks so much for joining us today, Jay.
You're welcome. And I want to thank Susan and Jeff, first of all, for this opportunity to share soil health. So hello, everyone, and we'll get started. Just a little background. Burleigh County producers, no-till producers, started using the cover crop combinations in 2006. So we have about a 5-year period now where we're starting to gain some information, and we try to put that in the form of some of these case studies. I think there's a real opportunity with the cover crops to design for what you don't have. And for today's topic, we'll cover some of the more common resource concerns that farmers are addressing when they're improving soil health. So some of those that we've listed on this first page are, of course, we'll start with crop diversity, It's probably one of the items that years ago in our ag systems within the U.S. we used to have quite a bit of crop diversity, and that's an item that's gotten less over the years, and something that we need to take a closer look at. So crop diversity is a very powerful item, and we'd like to highlight that a bit today. The surface armor, or the residue on the surface, is an item that most people have some difficulty obtaining. And when we get into the high biological systems, we have some difficulty in keeping it on the surface. So we'll look at that today too. And then, of course, building soil aggregates. Really, that's what no-tillers are doing. You know, they're building soil aggregates. They're putting the pore space back into the soil. And we're going to look at improving the water cycle. Initially, a lot of our systems, we just had difficulty getting the water into the profile. And of course, we've been able to improve our soils and the soil aggregates, and that's really changed the function, regarding the water cycle, and it's become much more efficient for us. Integrated pest management, we have some producers who have gotten some good results on reducing herbicide use. And so I think anytime we can bring cover crops into our cropping systems, we can see some benefits from an integrated pest management viewpoint. And of course, building soil organic matter, it's just the heartbeat of the soil, and it's something that definitely plays in as far as one of the resource concerns that farmers are generally dealing with. The nutrient cycle, we'll touch on it, especially some of the deep nutrient, that nitrate that's flushed below the rooting zone, and how to bring that back with a cover crop combination. The pollinators, another item that we want to address as a resource concern, especially the native pollinators, because they play such an important role in agriculture. Carbon-nitrogen ratio holds the key to a lot of the surface residue and just the functioning of the soil itself. And of course, the wildlife, food, and shelter. I would have to say I've never seen more wildlife than when we have a cover crop combination. The diversity in the cover crop just results in diversity of the wildlife. And of course, how do we bring livestock onto our cropland? This is an item that we used to have years ago. We've kind of lost that item. But anytime we can integrate livestock onto our cropping systems, the cover crops can be a real bridge to bring them onto the cropland. And there's a real benefit. So the principles of soil health are universal. But the road that you're going to take to get there is unique to each farm and each ranch. And it starts with identifying the resource concerns on a particular farm or a particular ranch. We're going to look at 4 case studies today on improving soil health with the cover crop combinations. We'll look at Brown's Ranch first, and then we'll be moving to Richter Farms. After that, we'll look at Blackleg Ranch and Menoken Farm. And you're going to find that each of these case studies, each individual one, moved down the soil health road a little differently. They all got to a very same end goal, but how they got there is always unique and always is different from any other farm. And I think that's what where the challenge is, but it also, is a good example of how the soil health basic principles are universal. So our average annual precip in Burley County is 16 inches. And our average elevation, if you picked out an average elevation in Burley County, I'd say about 1860 would be very close to an average elevation. And these case studies, I want to reemphasize, are actually on the ground. You can come to Burley County anytime you want, and we can drive out and take a look or talk to these farmers and ranchers. These are actual on-the-ground systems. So Brown's Ranch with Gabe and Paul Brown, one of the, they're always looking at more crop diversity, and they're always looking at how do they improve soil organic matter. And of course, the nutrient cycling with the carbon-nitrogen ratio is a big item for them because they have a lot of difficulty keeping residue on the surface. The biology is so active, it just takes away the residue so quickly. And of course, they put a lot of emphasis on integrating the livestock. So let's take a look at our first system. Of course, on all of these, we use native rangeland as our template. Native rangeland is what we look to, especially as an example of diversity. When you look at the hundreds and hundreds of species, all working together on native rangeland, it really gives us the sense of the importance of diversity and how we can bring that line of thought into our cropping systems. So with our cropping systems, we start bringing in warm season grass and cool and warm season broadleaf. Okay, we want to get the 4 major crop types. And of course, after those 2 crop types, we have the cool season grass and the cool season broadleaf. So that's one of the first items that anytime I'm working with a farmer or rancher, taking a look at their annual crop rotation, do you have all 4 crop types in your rotation? So if you take a look at under each major crop type, you'll see a listing of crops, and these are some of the usual and normal ones for the warm seasons, both broadleaf and grasses in Burleigh County, and some of the more common ones for the cool season broadleaves and the cool season grasses in this county. So we've got a lot of potential crops that we can use under each crop type, and then it's seeing that we can get them actually into the annual crop rotation. So now if we take that line of thought and we look at what Paul and Gabe have been doing, this is the example of the crops that they actually are using. Now these crops under each crop type are used either as an annual crop or they're used as a cover crop. Okay, and so you can tell at an eye glance here that they have good crop diversity. And so essentially what they're doing is they are feeding a balanced diet to the soil biology. If they were using just one crop type, and just as an example, let's say for instance they were using just the cool season grass, you would be feeding the soil biology a much more restricted diet. But when you bring in all 4 crop types, then it's kind of like bringing out the buffet. You have a much more balanced diet, and we're going to bring a little stronger biology. Soil organic matter is something that we've been tracking since the Browns have first moved into a no-till system in 1993. At that time, their soil organic matter levels were ranging from 1.7 to 2. And presently, they're in the neighborhood of 3.7 to 4.3 is their range. So you can see there's been a bit of an upward movement in their soil organic matter levels. And cover crops play a real role of importance here because they allow the harvest of additional sunlight. So no longer are you terminating sunlight harvest at harvest time for the crop. Now the cover crop goes on after, and consequently you have more opportunity to harvest additional sunlight. That sunlight gets harvested by the cover crop and ultimately is carbon in the soil. If we look at the nutrient cycling in terms of the carbon-nitrogen ratio, one thing you want to take a look at would be what is the carbon-nitrogen ratio of the soil. And most of the data you're going to find on this is going to be in the neighborhood of 11 to 1. Sometimes you'll find 10 to 1, 11 to 1. And you can see then that if you have a heavy wheat crop and that straw is on the soil surface, it's going to take a while for that 80 to 1 on the wheat straw to decompose down to the 11 to 1. So it kind of gives you a feel for how that situation works. Also, you can see that the bacteria have a carbon-nitrogen ratio of 5 to 1, while the protozoa have a carbon-nitrogen ratio of 30 to 1. And therein lies the issue with mineralization. So when the large guys, the protozoa, are eating the small guys, the bacteria, because of the difference in their carbon-nitrogen ratios, they excrete the excess in, and consequently we make nutrient available. But the carbon-nitrogen ratio of 11 to 1 with the soil is what we kind of want to bear in mind as we start to put together mixtures. Because the cover crop combinations, one of the advantages of them is you can adjust the carbon-nitrogen ratio to what you want or need. Whereas when you planted a monoculture, you could not adjust it. The Browns use a number of different times of the year when the cover crops go in. If it's the warm part of the year, they're looking at a warm season cocktail, and here's one of the mixtures that they've used in the past. Of course, that gets adjusted according to need, but you notice there's no cool season grass in this particular mixture. And so consequently, we get a chance here to use the crop types that we normally don't have, so frequently. But the legumes play the role of fixing nitrogen, whereas the millets play the role of more of the high carbon material for the soil surface. And the sunflower as well, more high carbon, where the radish and turnips play the role of securing as a nitrogen scavenger, so securing the deep nutrient, bringing it back to the surface and releasing it. And all of them together play the role of crop diversity. They also use cool season mixtures. This particular mixture you're looking at right here, they've taken away the corn silage out of their rotation, and it was replaced with this cool season mixture. And the advantage is there's much more residue on the soil surface. And that's an issue we have with a lot of our cropping systems in the county, is if the corn is taken for silage, we have very bare fields in the fall. Whereas if we come in with a close-seeded cover crop combination, the turnip, radish, red clover, for instance, will regrow after the canopy is taken off, and we can maintain cover, we can maintain armor on our soils. This is probably one of the better examples I can give you of the carbon-nitrogen ratio and how quickly residue can disappear. The photo on the left, the June 16th photo, shows the cover crop from the previous year decomposing by the middle of June. And the photo on the right is the same field, and that was taken on July 1st, so a couple weeks later. And if you take a look between the rows, you'll notice that the residue has decomposed very quickly in that 2-week period. So these are fields, the browns have fields with soil biology that's very active, and consequently their goal is, when they plant cover crops, how do I get more high carbon material? So they're going to put a cover crop in with a fairly high carbon-nitrogen ratio because their soils are so active. And one of the primary issues has been, how do we maintain the armor? We definitely like to maintain it until we have full crop canopy, but in this particular picture on July 1, you can see we're probably going to run out of residue before the crop canopies. Armor on the surface, Paul and Gabe are very good at providing that. This particular field illustrates it pretty well. This field was a cowpea millet combination the previous year. The livestock grazed it in the late fall, and they put a good armor down on the surface. And so anytime the residue is grazed, the browns try to remove approximately 30 to 40% of the material with the livestock, usually never more than half, and the other half is for the soil. The livestock are integrated in the fall primarily, and they'll come in and do late fall grazing, early winter grazing on the cover crop combinations. So in this manner, they were able to bring the livestock in the late fall, early winter. They've been very successful at bringing the livestock in. It allows the livestock to come off of the native rangeland earlier, and that time of year, the native rangeland does not have as high nutrition as it does earlier in the summer. So it's a real opportunity to bring the diet level up on the livestock, and it gives additional recovery time to the native rangeland. And so consequently, you've got a bit of a win-win, plus you're bringing the biology of the livestock onto the cropland. The mob grazing is another way that the browns have gone ahead and they've secured the bringing the livestock in during the summer. And so consequently, in this particular example from the summer, they had 327 yearlings on 1/3 of an acre paddocks, if you will. And so they moved 6 times a day, and the 327 yearlings were then consuming 2 acres of cover crop combination per day. Now, that alone is one item, but then what about the armor on the surface? And this shows you an example of what the soil surface looked like after the livestock moved. And so consequently, you can see they had a very good mat of material, and this cover does not last very long for the browns because it cycles so quickly, but it allows them to replenish that armor on the surface. Second case study we're going to look at is Richter Farms with Marlon and Patrick Richter. And providing soil surface armor is one of their concerns on their sands. Building soil aggregates again. They were starting no-till in 01, and they've been building soil aggregates and doing a good job of putting the pore space back in. Water's critical for them. They can't hold very much water in their soils, and so the water cycle was a major item. And of course, integrated pest management, reducing herbicides again, herbicide use, and building soil organic matter, and integrating the livestock. So with Richter Farms, the task became, how do we bring the cover crops into their cropping system? And the first thing we looked at with the Richters was, where's our window to seed the cover crop? So we look at their annual crop system and find the early harvested crops. And in their particular scenario, the field pea and the winter triticale were the two early harvested crops. So that's where we came in with the cover crop. The particular cover crop that we first put on Richter Farms was a combination. Again, you'll find that we really didn't put any cool season grass in, because they had a real history of a lot of cool season grass. And so consequently, this was a scenario where we could start putting in the crop types that they typically have been very weak in their rotation in. And in this particular case, we used the warm season grasses, the warm season broadleaves, and the cool season broadleaves. And of course, with their high leach potential sands, it was a real opportunity to bring in the nitrogen scavengers like turnip and radish and gather up that deep nitrate. And it was a real opportunity, too, to bring in some of the warm season grasses like millet, where we could get some armor on the surface. And of course, we had the cowpea and soybean and sweet clover cycling some atmospheric nitrogen for us at the same time. This particular mixture then was ready to graze on October 1st. And so the Richters went ahead and they weighed the calves on this 141 pair. They weighed the calves before and after. So they weighed them, they turned them in on October 1st, and they did 17 acres of grazing. Now, with the thought of the dual feeding system, essentially you're feeding the livestock above the soil and you're feeding the soil biology underneath. And you have to keep these two in mind, and the Richters have been just really good at making this type of thing work. And so consequently, if you think in terms of what does the biology weigh, it really puts it in perspective. And in this example here, it shows what 1 acre of soil biology weighs. Now, if you go to the low end, for instance, the low end of the range for the bacteria, the fungi, the protozoa, and the nematodes, one cow with a calf on 1 acre will still be outweighed by the biology. And that really helps a rancher, it helps me, it helps anyone kind of put it in perspective of why it's so important that we leave that surface residue. Now you can see if you go to the high end of the range, you got some extremely high weights. And now you can also see why Gabe and Paul Brown, why the residue would disappear so quickly. So this is an example that I frequently use with the ranchers to help illustrate the importance of leaving the surface armor. Well, we ended up with a 52-pound average gain on the calves, and that was a 3.1 average daily gain, which is a very strong gain, and they did very well. And if they went immediately to the sales barn, I believe within 2 days of coming off of the cover crop. And if we take a look at our some of our net profit, we had a gross income of $111 per acre with an expense of $45 per acre. So that netted the Richters $66. But then there were also benefits that are more difficult to put a dollar amount on. So what was the increased recovery time on the native grassland worth? And what about the improved soil health on that cropland? And so those are items that we continue to take additional look at. So the following spring, the photo on the left shows Marlon Richter planting corn beginning of May. And the photo on the right is one of myself about 4 miles away. And if you notice, there's a fence post right here. And there's 2 wires buried beneath that sediment. We had a very dry spring in 2008, And consequently, the field where Marlin was planting was very secure, no soil moving, but that was not true of a number of other fields. Dr. Chris Nichols, who works with ARS at Mandan, North Dakota, and is a member of the Burleigh County team as well, took a look at the cover crop and took some of the millet root. And the photo on the left is just a really good example of building soil aggregates. And the very small biology starts with the very small aggregates, and the larger biology starts hooking them together with the glomalin, and consequently we start to build soil aggregates quite quickly in the root zone. Little enlarged picture of the soil aggregates give you a little bit better idea of how you're putting the pore space back into the soil. And of course, with the glomalin serving as the glue, we can hold these together very well, and they definitely start to move forward towards soil health. Now, in that same particular field that spring, we decided to take a look at the available water capacity, because one of the questions that a lot of the farmers ask us is, well, why would I plant a cover crop and use up all of my water? And so to help address that, we took the profile 1 foot increments to the 4 foot profile. And we did that in the field that had the cover crops in, and then we also did that in the field next to it, which did not have the cover crop in it. Okay? And so if we look at the far right column, the available water capacity column, that particular soil could hold 6.1 inches of water in a 4 foot profile. And then if we take a look at what actually occurred, it was a very dry spring, one of the driest springs ever recorded at the Bismarck Airport. And if we take a look at the field that had no cover crop on after the pea harvest, then we find 3.11 inches of water available. If we look at the cover crop field, keep in mind now this also grew the pea crop and then it grew the cover crop after that, we had 3.07. And so what was occurring was we essentially recharged the profile back on the cover crop side to within 0.04 of an inch of precip. So essentially they came out virtually the same. The difference, of course, was we had a good canopy and we reduced our evapotranspiration, and we reduced any moisture leaving from an evaporation viewpoint because of the cover crop cover. And we felt it illustrated the point quite well of how it comes down to management. In addition, the cover crop side was rather clean the next spring. We really had no weed pressure on it, whereas the side that did not have the cover crop had a lot of winter annuals. Now, as it played out for the herbicide expense, the cover crop side, as you can see right here, the cover crop resulted in a $12 total cost, whereas the no cover crop with manure and the no cover crop with no manure, those two fields also took an additional herbicide application. And so we were able to cut out one herbicide application the year the cover crop was seeded, and the next year when the corn was seeded, a very similar thing played out, because then we were able to reduce another herbicide application where the cover crop had been planted. So we got a 2-year benefit out of it regarding IPM by reducing herbicide applications both years. Now the Richters, when they started into their no-till system in 2001, their average soil organic matter was 1.5%, but they also had some fields that were less than 1%. And these are fields that had their attention, and they were working hard to try to improve the soil health and raise the soil organic matter levels. And now 9 years later, they are averaging 2.5. So they had about a 1% improvement in soil organic matter, and your soils are going to function at a much better level anytime we can get above 1%. If we look at the what happens with available water capacity when we improve soil organic matter, we'll take the Richters under the sand column right here, and they were at 1%, and so there was 1 inch of water per foot. When they moved to 2% soil organic matter, they went to 1.4% of inches of water per 1 foot of soil. So there was quite an improvement in their bucket. The size of their bucket is now larger to hold water. And what we've observed happening in the county when we had the low diversity, no cover crops, and we had a lot of mechanical tillage with erosion, is we basically created our own drought. And now we're looking at a situation with operators like the Richters, where they were improving the efficiency and the ability to hold water. If we look at that same improvement in soil organic matter from a nutrient manner, we can see that for every 1% mineralizing at 2 to 3%, there's going to be about a 20 to 30 pounds of usable N that would be mineralized over the course of a year, approximately. Now, when we go to 2%, when they improve to 2%, all of a sudden the 20 to 30 pounds becomes 40 to 60 pounds of usable N per acre. And so there was a real significant gain, not only in water, terms of water and being able to hold water, but also in terms of nutrient. The other interesting thing is if we look at this top line, we can find our carbon-nitrogen ratio of the soil. So if we take the 10,000 pounds of carbon and reduce it down with the 1,000 pounds of nitrogen, you can see where you get the 10 to 1 or that approximately 11 to 1 ratio on the soil. Our third case study is Blackleg Ranch. It's Jerry, Jeremy, Jay, and Jace Doan. And they also are on high leach potential sands, and we're looking at promoting improving the nutrient cycling. They also do custom fee hunting and guiding for wildlife hunting, and so consequently that's part of their one of their resource concerns. And then how to integrate their livestock. Presently, the livestock are wintered by an intermittent stream, and they were looking at moving them into a safer environment from a water quality viewpoint and from a herd health viewpoint. The Doans have done an excellent job in bringing cover crops in, and their manner of how they did it is they went with a warm season cover crop combination on 300 acres, and they seeded that in mid-June. And the design of the cover crop was to lean into the nutrient cycling, the wildlife, and the livestock integration. So this particular field did have one herbicide burned down on June 17th. It had no commercial fertilizer. And this is what the field looked like on June 25th. This is the seeding that the Doans went with. And everything really played a role here. Keep in mind now with the wildlife, they wanted some vertical height. And so the pearl millet and the sunflower and the sedan supplied the vertical height. Okay, and then of course we had deep nitrate that we know has been flushed, because if we would get in these particular soils, if you get a 2 or 3 inch rain on a June wheat field, it's not uncommon a couple days later for that wheat field to get quite yellow looking. So we know we flushed nitrate over the years, and we've got the radish and turnip to help us bring that up. And of course we've got the proso millet to also supply some wildlife food, and we've got the legumes in there to supply some nutrient cycling, and we've got a little bit of corn for the vertical height as well. So that was some of the reasoning on the mixture that was put together to address their specific resource concerns. This is what the field looked like on July 20th. And if we take a little closer look at it, you can see the diversity. You can see the brassicas, and you can see the warm season grasses, and everything is in here helping each other, working together. So many of us, myself included, used to have the thought that these plants are competing. But when we start to get a better understanding through nature, these plants are there to help each other. And it certainly isn't the first time that nature has seen this many plants together. It also became one of our stops on one of our soil health tours this summer. We had a couple of tours, and we had one on September 16th with a number of stops, and this particular one we listened to the Doans explain how they used it in their system. And there was a lot of interest, and we had a lot of good discussion at this particular site. Now, more recently, when we got into November, the Doans went ahead and mowed a strip, maybe every 25 or 30 acres or so. They went ahead and windrowed a strip. You can see it right on this photo here. And that would be a place where the hunters could walk. And then they also put some fence posts out there at the same time. So that strip serves a couple of purposes. One was for the hunters, and after hunting season, earlier or later in the winter, and there's more than one window where they can be brought in. But the beauty of the cover crop here was how it served a number of different resource concerns at one time. And so we were able to look at the soil health aspect by bringing this cover crop combination onto the cropland. We were able to look at water quality because we're bringing the deep nitrate up. I think herd health we think is going to be better, because anytime we bring the herd health out onto a grazing scenario in the winter, we've seen an improvement in the herd. The wildlife enhancement, the wildlife flourished very well out there this summer, and of course this was our window to bring the livestock onto the cropland. Our last case study is the Menoken farm, and the Menoken farm is owned and operated by the Burleigh County Soil Conservation District. And it's intended to be an educational farm. And essentially, there's 10 fields, that cropland fields, that are available at the Menoken farm. One of them has commercial fertilizer or any other fossil fuel input on it, whereas the other 9 have no commercial fertilizer, no insecticides, no fungicides, and we try to limit the amount of pesticide in general as far as a herbicide. And so anytime we can reduce the fossil fuel inputs, we definitely do it, and our goal here is to improve the soil health. And so we'd look at the crop diversity, the nutrient cycling, enhancing the pollinators, and integrating the livestock at the Menoken farm. And to start our last case study out, if we take a look at a soil food web analysis on the Menoken farm, the soil food web analysis is not a standard soil test. Where a standard soil test, you're looking at N, P, and K. With the soil food web, you're looking at the live biology, the diversity, and the amounts of each. And you'll notice at the Menoken farm, we have on the top red flags with the total bacteria and the total fungi. You can notice that you're looking at significantly more bacteria than you are fungi. And also, if you come down to the lower right-hand corner on the plant available in supply, you'll notice that the amount of mineralization that's likely to occur over the summer is calculated at anywhere from 25 to 50 pounds. Well, essentially what we're lacking so much of with the Menoken farm, because it's our 2009 was the first year that we started with it. It came out of a tillage environment with the residue removed, and it went into the no-till system with the cover crops, etc. You can see where we don't have a lot of the bigger guys here. We're kind of low on some of the protozoa, and we're low on the nematodes. So we don't have very many big guys to eat the little guys up here. And so we don't have a lot of mineralization going on. I would say this is soil biology that probably has not been fed a balanced diet in a long time, and with no surface armor. If we look at Paul and Gay Brown's soil food web analysis, you'll notice some things that are different. First of all, the 2 arrows up on top with the total biology and the total fungal, you're looking at a much closer, not a 1-to-1 ratio, but they're a bit more in balance, if you will. And a little bit more available protozoa. You know, we've got a little stronger look at, as far as some of the big guys available to create that mineralization. And then if you look at the lower right on the plant available in supply, you can see that it's estimated at approximately 200 units of N, which is significant. So you can see the difference between starting into soil health when you compare it to a system that's been going at it for quite a number of years. So one of the first things we decided we needed armor. And so P was seeded in spring of 2009. And then on July 16th, that armor was crop rolled. And so it was just rolled to supply the armor, bring cover onto the soil to start the healing process. And there was a lot of weed pressure in this P as well. So after we rolled it, we did put on a herbicide application to take out our grass weeds like wild oats, pigeon grass, etc., because tremendous weed pressure. Interestingly enough, after we crop rolled it, and immediately after crop rolling, we seeded an 8-way cover crop combination, and it was interesting how it stayed so clean the rest of the year. Now we had some cover, we got some armor on the surface, and we got some diversity of plants. And it's as though nature looked at it and said, well, maybe I don't need to supply quite as much weed pressure as I've been, and appeared to back off of that a bit. Now, this is what that particular cover crop looked like on September 4th. And we went in with some crop diversity because we knew we had, all of these resource concerns to take care of. And of course, getting the water into the profile was a real issue because most of the water ran off. And so we had all of these goals in mind, but this cover crop combination was a good way to start. And especially once we had the P rolled to create the canopy, to create the residue armor, and then we'll come in with the diversity. Now that particular field was planted to corn this spring. And this is a picture on May 20th where the corn is being seeded. And we drilled it directly into the cover crop residue from the previous year, from last year. It did have a herbicide control on it for weed control. It did not have commercial fertilizer. So there was no commercial fertilizer put on it. And this is the picture of the cornfield in July. It had a good, healthy look to it. And we decided to do a tissue analysis to see how the plant was doing. So we sent the tissue analysis in. Half of the field had 1 to 2 tons of compost applied with 2 compost tea applications, no commercial fertilizer. So if you take a look at this particular reading, you're going to find that everything was in the high range. So virtually, essentially that plant was doing quite well. Everything was in the high range and the crop looked very healthy. The other half of the field had no compost applied, no compost tea, and no commercial fertilizer. Now there, if you take a look at the nutrient levels, these test levels are still in the sufficient range. So they're still satisfactory, although now they're at the lower end of the range, but they're still in the range. So both halves of the field were doing fine. Both of them were in the sufficient range, one at the bottom of the range, one at the top of the range. Now this corn was harvested on November 8th, and we had a good yield on it. And both sides, of course, like we mentioned, were planted into last year's cover crop residue. And our average yield in Burleigh County on corn over the last 5 years is 100 bushels per acre. So if we looked at the west side, we had a yield of 122 bushels of corn on the west side. It had no commercial fertilizer, no compost tea, no compost, but it was planted into last year's full season cover crop. Now on the east half, we had no commercial fertilizer, but we did put on 2 compost tea applications, and we did put on 1 to 2 tons of compost. That field yielded 129 bushels. Now I think there's going to be a more long-term impact on soil health on this east side also, because we applied the tea and the compost, and we're going to get more than 1 year's benefit out of the compost as far as healing towards soil health. But this is one of the better examples I can give you of the power of diversity. And so consequently, when we brought in the diversity last year, it it's as though it accelerates biological time. Now, we could have brought in that 8-way mixture one crop at a time, but you're not going to get that impact like you are when you bring them all together. We also use some cool season cover crop combinations at the Menoken farm. This one was a 14-way species, and we put this one on the field that we felt probably had the poorest soil health. And so this is meant to be a healing year for it. And then also, this will be next year's corn. So spring of 2011, this particular field here with the 14-way species mix on it is going to become a cornfield. And of course, there will be no commercial fertilizer put that on either. We will be grazing that, or in fact, we did already do grazing on this particular field. We brought in 182 pair, and they were on this field for 2 to 3 days. And their goal was to remove maybe 30–40% of the material, and the rest needs to be on the soil surface, because again, the dual feeding system. Also in this mix, we included Phacelia, and specifically to try to improve the scenario with the pollinators. And the Phacelia definitely is an attractant to the pollinators. When you would walk into this field, if you would walk in and close your eyes, it was just alive with sound. And so the pollinators were very present, and we were very happy with some of the impacts that we had with all the flowering plants in that 14-way mixture. We also used some warm season cover crop combinations at the Menoken farm. And this one also would be grazed, and of course we'll only remove 40 or probably not more than 50% of the material. And again, this mixture went on one of the fields that we felt had some of the poorest soil health also. And next year, this will also be a corn crop. And so it's the process of building it back. Livestock are integrated. The livestock are going to definitely help us with the economics on the cover crop years. And of course, they bring the biology to the soil. And so when the livestock come onto the cropland, it's their hair, it's their saliva, it's the urine, it's the dung, it's milk foam, it's everything that comes off this cow that has biology. And that biology, the cattle with the soil, definitely evolved together for many years. And the livestock can also be used to help us convert the high carbon material to a lower carbon material. And so they're very beneficial that way, so many uses for them. And of course, anytime we get the additional recovery time on natives. So the livestock are definitely going to play an important role on integration onto the cropland at the Menoken farm. So where can we go in our Great Plains ag system? Well, I think we want to keep in mind that we're supplying the soil biology with a food and a home. I think we've kind of illustrated some of that as we've gone through the case studies. And we look at using the cropping systems and the grazing systems, the cover crops and the livestock. We look at those as tools. And those are all tools that we can use to improve soil health. So when we start looking at soil health, all of these items become tools, and we start addressing the resource concerns. And then a good friend of mine in soil health, John Sticka, summarizes this for me very well. Anytime we can minimize the soil disturbance, provide the armor, anytime we can take a look at the continual live plant, and of course it's diversity, diversity, diversity. Those are such important items. I also wanted to include a little bit about self-education. The books on the left are some good reading materials. They also are probably some of the better reference books. For instance, The Nature and Property of Soils, 14th edition, I would recommend to anyone. Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden is about the Native American ag system on the Missouri River bottom here in North Dakota. The Agroecology helps put some things in perspective. One Straw Revolution, one Japanese farmers move toward soil health. And Managing Cover Crops Profitably, very good material regarding individual crops that can be used as cover crops. And so it It's a quick glance, but it really has a lot of good information on crops. It really helps put it in perspective. Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond helps us take a look at how our continent's played out in terms of native crops that occurred on them. And I think it kind of helps us open our minds up in terms of cropping systems. The Soil Biology Primer definitely helps us with the how does the biology function, and Dr. Ingham has done a very good job of putting that together. And then some of the websites, the Burleigh County SCD website has a number of case studies on it. You can definitely go to that website, which is our local website here, and I think you can find some good information on the case studies. We have a number of farmers and ranchers who we've captured their systems, and they're in a PowerPoint format that you can definitely take a look at. DakotaLakes.com, Dr. Dwayne Beck and Pierre, one of our team members. It's always a good website to go for additional information. SustainableRanching.com is Paul and Gabe Brown. It's an excellent website to take a look at as well. Manitoba, North Dakota Zero-Till organization. And then Cedar Meadow Farms, of course, in Pennsylvania with Steve Groff, well-known no-tiller and cover crop advocate. So that brings me to the end of the presentation, and just want to thank ATRA for this opportunity, and ready to turn it back to Jeff or Susan.
Okay, this is Susan, and I'd like to thank Jay for joining us today and sharing this topic, and thanks to our listeners for attending this webinar. We really hope this has been useful information. One further note I'd like to add, another resource that didn't quite make it into our slides today is the USDA Agricultural Research Service, the ARS in Mandan, North Dakota. They have a website with a cover crops chart similar to a periodic table with 46 species of cover crops listed. And their website is at www.mandan.ars.usda.gov. And just another reminder to check back on our website for that series of written case studies on cover crop cocktails. We will be delving more in depth on the Brown Farm, the Richter Farm, and the Menoken Farm, and those will be in written form, giving more specifics on seeding dates and yields and harvest dates and things like that. We hope to have those released in early 2011. Also, to let you know that ATRA hosts a toll-free phone line for farmers and ranchers to ask questions on sustainable agriculture. That number is 1-800-346-9140. We have various specialists on staff who answer these questions, and we're happy to assist however we can. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jeff for any questions that we may have from our audience.
Thanks, Susan. Again, this is Jeff Berkby with the National Center for Appropriate Technology. And first, thank you, Jay, for such an illuminating presentation. We've had over 600 listeners today stick with us through the presentation, and had a wonderful variety of questions be asked online during the presentation. And we'll take about 10 minutes here for questions. I know we're at the top of the hour, and some of you may have to leave. A reminder, if you have to leave or didn't catch everything during the presentation, the entire webinar will be available on the ATRA website, and that's on your, you can see that address, the National Sustainable Agriculture Information Service. You can download or watch the entire webinar online. It'll be up within a day. We'll have the webinar up online, certainly by the first of next week. So if you missed something or needed to refresh your memory, then just go on our website and watch the webinar again. Jay, I'll start with you. Susan, feel free to kick in too. We had a lot of questions about the regionalization of cover crop cocktails. And the basic question is, you showed examples in North Dakota in corn growing operations, but what about applications for other types of crops or at higher elevations, in drier areas in the U.S., in wetter areas? Is this technology and the technique applicable in other types of ecosystems?
Well, it's an item, Jeff, that we've addressed with other groups, and I think specifically in terms of talking with some of the people from Wyoming, Colorado, etc., that are maybe in a bit of a drier scenario than we are, and what you would put into that particular mixture, will it change? Yes. Will the concept change as far as the diversity and trying to, still balance out your crop types? We're still gonna want to keep that thought in mind. But I'll give you a good example. One of the questions we've had recently was, from a very dry, hot area of the nation, and of course, in that type of environment, you're going to change some of these species. And I'll give you an example. The cowpea is an item that just really handles the dry, hot conditions very well. And first time we used that plant was in 2006. And we had a drought that during the growing season, we had 1.5 inches of rain during our entire growing season. Mm-hmm. And the cowpea handled that just extremely well. And I think the lesson here is in diversity, because the other thing we found out in 2006 was our monoculture cover crop species basically just virtually dried up and died. But anytime we put them into the combination where we started getting 6, 7, 8 species together, they flourished side by side. The combinations did quite well. The monocultures struggled. And so we definitely want to stay with the strength of diversity, but our plants are going to change in terms of our specific locale. Yes.
And Jay, that kind of leads to another question many of our listeners had, is that they saw this list of the combinations of cover crop cocktails in North Dakota, and they're saying to themselves, how do I determine the proper mix of cocktails of cover crops in my area? Are there people who are learning this stuff in extension agencies and soil conservation services, and how do I find the experts to come to my farm and figure out the mix that I need for my situation?
Well, I think, and that's a good question. I would definitely encourage the local soil district and the local NRCS office. I would definitely start with them. And I think you're going to find, across the nation that the expertise in this area is going to vary because, we haven't been into this for a very long period of time yet. But we do have some things that can help. The managing cover crops profitably definitely can help us. If you go onto our BCSCD website, there's probably 10 PowerPoints of different farmers and ranchers in the county who are using cover crop combinations, and you can take a look and see how they played out. And I think what's important to make this work is kind of, you got to form a bit of a team, and you start moving into it. When we moved into it in Burley County, we started with 25-acre mini grants, if you will, where we would set up a 25-acre seeding with an individual farmer. We didn't go in with real large seedings initially. We went in with smaller ones. So it's a bit of a learning process and a bit of a self-education process. But our data that we're gaining is improving. Susan mentioned the ARS periodic table for cover crops, very good source for this also, because it explains what each of these individual species brings to the table. So I'd start taking a look at the ARS cover crop chart. I think that would be helpful, the managing the cover crops profitably. But the true understanding of why you're using the mixture lies in identifying your resource concerns on the ground.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So a couple of technical questions we had too. Several listeners wondered to know about what sort of specialized equipment do you use to plant the variety in the mixtures of the cover crop cocktail? Okay.
When we plant the mixtures, normally what we'll do is sometimes we'll just use if livestock people are going to be familiar with a mixer grinder, we've used that to put our mixture together. Sometimes we've had it custom mixed right here in Bismarck because the local seed companies here are very accustomed to dealing with cover crop mixtures, and they'll actually put them together for you. And so we've gone that route. And when we put them into the drill, we usually don't fill the drill box up because we don't want the big and small seeds to start to sort out. And so we'll maybe fill a third or half of that box. And we'll go with a 1-inch seeding depth. And 1 inch is a little bit shy for the big seeds. It's a little bit deep for the little seeds. But it's interesting what happens. the little seeds just start to follow the big ones right to the surface. And so we've been very successful in a no-till environment with a 1-inch seeding depth. And the mixture can be done in the truck. It can be done with a mixer grinder. There's different ways to do that, but all of them will work just fine.
Jay, we had some questions too about options. We talked a lot about using livestock to terminate the cover crop, and some people were saying, if I don't have livestock or I've got a very small operation, are there any other options you've seen to mob grazing and large amounts of livestock?
As far as termination, we do have people who plant the cover crops and let frost terminate them. And so there is no harvesting of them of livestock. And then they'll just seed directly into that material the next spring. And we're primarily using no-till drills with disc type openers, and so we have no issue seeding directly into that material the next spring. So the frost can terminate it. If you chose to terminate earlier, you could use a herbicide if you chose to terminate earlier yet. We haven't done that. We normally let ours go full season, and we let the frost terminate them. We'll come in with livestock if livestock are available. If they aren't, we'll just leave that material stand, and we'll seed directly into it the next spring.
Have you seen any issues with pests or weeds in the cover crop itself, or does it affect the cover crop, reduce those problems?
Well, what we've observed from a weed pressure viewpoint, we'll normally do some type of herbicide cleanup, burn down, if you will, prior to seeding the cover crop. Now, once you've seeded the cover crop, there is no herbicide application because there is no herbicide that's going to be able to do weed control for you. But it's been an interesting observation because when you bring in that kind of diversity, it virtually outcompetes the vast majority of the weed issues. Now, of course, if you have some extreme cases that, you're going to have to take whatever precautions you need to get the weeds under control. Most of our cover crops are being seeded in systems where maybe they've been into a no-till system with high diversity for the last 5, 10, even 15 years. And weed control issues are pretty small. And so we've had good success with it because, like I mentioned earlier, the weeds are kind of basically a symptom. And, it's telling you that we need to improve soil health. And so when we bring the combinations on, it's usually a real positive item in terms of weed control and future weed control.
I know most of the examples you have really dramatically reduced the amount of pesticide or herbicide used in your operations. Are you seeing attempts, too, for certified organic operations or those to try to use these techniques to really go the full distance and try to eliminate herbicide use entirely?
That's a good question. Brown Ranch is, if they're not down to 0 on commercial fertilizer, they're extremely close to it. They're probably using some commercial fertilizer, maybe on some of the newer rented land, but on their long-term acres, they've virtually eliminated all commercial fertilizer. And interestingly enough, in 2009, the organic growers in Burleigh County are now using cover crops also. And so we've got combinations, let me clarify, they're now using the cover crop combinations. And so the organic people, I think, are seeing a good window here with a good nutrient source following a cover crop combination. So for the traditional no-till people, yes, I can see a definite window to reduce commercial fertilizer use, be very positive for soil health. And I think with the existing organic people, I think they can see a good nutrient window as well.
So both fertilizer and herbicide use, you're hoping to see more and more reduction as time goes on?
I definitely think we can, like the Richter's example is showing us that we definitely can reduce herbicide. And if we take a look at weed herbicide use, for instance, going back to Gabe and Paul Brown, they've been able to reduce their herbicide use dramatically. And of course, they are the system in the county that probably has the most experience too, most long-term use of a cover crop, and then switching over to the combination cover crops in '06. And they've been have had a significant impact on reduction of herbicide as well. Yes. So the window is going to be there, and again, it's kind of a universal thing. But how each of these case studies achieves it is going to be unique.
One of your slides, we talked about the higher bushels per acre on the Menoken farm than in the conventional growth there in North Dakota. Did you also measure not only bushels per acre, but the nutritional quality of the corn raised on that farm and how that compared to conventional production?
One of the long-term goals at Menoken Farm is to start taking a look at the quality of the food. Now, we have not achieved that yet with the corn. This is an item that we have preserved the corn. We have the corn samples. And this is an item that we want to start taking a look at the nutrient content of the grain, because our long-term philosophy, if you will, is going to be soil health, food health, and moving into people health. And we feel there's a direct connect between all of them. And as we move down this road, Jeff, that's definitely probably the next item we're going to be looking at.
And that probably, you'll get more and more data that will help us really do a full cost analysis of the economics of the whole system. And as we increase the cost for cover crops, that we decrease the cost for herbicides, and then we increase the return by our livestock that we can harvest. There's all these variables, but are you feeling overall, though, that there really is a net positive when you weigh apples and apples, or herbicides versus no-till, that's really, the numbers are really looking good?
What I think what gives me hope on this, and I look at it kind of as a story of hope, because I think the road we've been going down with, and just take for instance our commercial fertilizer use, of how it increases from year to year, and how the efficiency of it, of what we're producing, is not increasing. And so we start taking a look at this whole big picture, and it comes down to how do we decrease our dependency on fossil fuel inputs? How do we start bringing the commercial fertilizer application rates down? How do we bring all the pesticides down? And I think as we look at all of these fossil fuel inputs and we look at the impact on soil health, and how do we bring the soil health level up, and how do we bring the fossil fuel use down, I think is the key. And we have to bring those two together and achieve them simultaneously.
Sort of a trend question here, I think, that maybe as we wrap up, I know you're seeing, and maybe just comment on how are you seeing the growth of interest, both nationwide and worldwide, in cover crop cocktails and no-till, and are there really exciting hotbeds in the world where this is really taking off, and how do we educate our own extension agent or soil conservation service person in our district about what's happening and get them on board with this?
Well, yeah, you asked a good question, Jeff. Let me give you an example. We operate as a team here in Burleigh County with our district supervisors and our office staff, and then we got some outlying perimeter people in terms of Dr. Chris Nichols or those type people. And so we have this team, and 4 years ago we had approximately 40 requests for speaking engagements that the team did in a year's time. 3 years ago that went to 65. 2 years ago that went to, I believe, 80 is what I recall. This past year it approached 90. And this year we're going to exceed that. And so the speaking requests for soil health have just kept increasing. And interestingly enough, other countries, very much so, yes. Most recently, Canada. There's some real strong interest, I think, in the Swift Current area. And Russia's taken a serious look at it. France has moved into no-till cropping systems. And the interesting thing they have done is they went into no-till cropping systems simultaneously with the cover crops. And so that's an interesting concept, because most of the time when somebody switches into a no-till system, they switch in and they get started on their cropping, and then maybe eventually someday they look at a cover crop. But in France, it all happened at the same time. I think there's also some real strong interest in Missouri. I think there's definitely some people there that can make a real difference with the farmers and ranchers. We've had some strong, I think, strong movement come in terms of South Dakota, Nebraska. There's just, and more recently, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Mm-hmm. And so there's been just some real interest going on, and these are people who want to make this change, and they want to make this occur.
Well, and I think having you present this webinar today to, as I said, over 600 listeners, and again, having the webinar available on our website, and I think you'll have it on your website there in North Dakota soon, will help spread the word too.
Well, we appreciate the opportunity to discuss soil health.
Oh, it's been great having you, Jay, and we're honored to have shared the stage with you. I think at that we'll wrap up the questions and remind our listeners that if you didn't catch everything on this webinar, it will be available in a day or two on the ATTRA website that's on your screen right now, the National Sustainable Ag Information Service at attra.ncat.org. And also you can call that toll-free number on your screen, and if you didn't get your questions answered online, then we'll be glad to answer them, and I'm sure Jay will be in the loop there too. So again, Jay, thank you so much for your time today. And,
thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Susan, too. And thanks to all of our listeners. I'll remind you that we'll have more webinars coming up this year on sustainable agriculture, and we'll be sending out press releases about those, so tune into those. And thanks again to everyone for listening. Goodbye.
Yep. Bye now.
Bye-bye.